All right, let's jump into this deep dive on composting and worm farming. Looks like we've got a really cool manual from Hawkesbury City Council to guide us. So get ready to learn how to turn those kitchen scraps into, well, garden gold.
Definitely a timely topic. This manual starts off with a pretty startling statistic. It turns out Australians are massive waste generators, second only to the U.S. per capita.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, something like 800 kilograms per person every year.
800 kilograms. That's going to be like what, 2 grand pianos worth of trash per person?
Pretty much.
And the manual says a big chunk of that is actually compostable, right? Like food scraps, garden waste, things like that.
Yeah, in New South Wales, it's around 65% that could be composted.
So that's a ton of potential just going to waste, literally sitting in landfills.
It's more than just the space, though. Landfills are actually huge contributors to greenhouse gas emissions.
Right, all that stuff decomposing.
Exactly. And without air, that breakdown releases methane and carbon dioxide,
Mm.
which are, as we know, potent greenhouse gases.
Okay, so composting is definitely a good thing to do. But I have a feeling it's a bit more involved than just tossing banana peels in a pile out back.
You got it. It's not just decomposition. It's about creating a whole ecosystem. We're talking about microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, all these tiny creatures breaking down organic matter, and they transform it into, well, think of it as nutrient gold for your garden.
So it's like setting up a little microscopic city in our compost bin, with all these workers breaking things down and building something valuable.
Perfect analogy.
Hmm.
And this manual stresses that it's not random. There are certain things that make or break a compost. They call it the ADAM acronym.
Adam. All right, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Stands for aliveness, diversity, aeration, and moisture. We've touched on the aliveness part, compost being a living thing. Those microorganisms need the right conditions to work their magic.
So it's not just a pile of rotting stuff, it's like a carefully balanced environment. What about diversity? Why is that so important?
That's about what you put in your compost. You need a mix of nitrogen-rich stuff, like kitchen scraps, and carbon-rich stuff, like dry leaves. Think of it as a balanced diet for your compost critters. Get that balance right, and you get efficient decomposition and a nutrient-rich end product.
Hmm. Makes me look at my trash can a bit differently now. What about aeration? I know you have to turn a compost pile, but why is that so important?
Oxygen. Those little guys need oxygen to do their thing. Turn the pile brings in air, which stops things from going anaerobic. That's the kind of decomposition that creates those nasty rotten egg smells.
So it's more than just avoiding the stink. The air actually helps the whole process work better. Got it. And finally, moisture. I'm guessing those microorganisms need water to survive, just like everything else, right?
Spot on. Needs to be just the right amount, like a wrung-out sponge, the manual says. Too dry, and things slow down. Too wet, and you risk those anaerobic conditions again.
So we've got our ADAM acronym: aliveness, diversity, aeration, and moisture. Seems like mastering these four is the key to a thriving compost. And I know there are a bunch of ways to actually set up a compost system. What are some of the options, and what should we consider when choosing one?
Well, it really depends on things like space, your budget, and how much effort you want to put in. Simplest, most affordable is the basic compost pile. Just like it sounds, a designated spot in your yard where you pile up your compostable materials.
Back to basics, classic approach. But I imagine there are some downsides to just having an open pile in your yard.
Can be a bit messy visually, and it does need regular turning to keep the air flowing. Plus, it's exposed to the elements, rain, sun, which affects moisture and temperature.
Okay, so what if I want something a little more contained, looking a bit neater in the backyard?
Then a wire enclosure might be good. Still pretty cheap and easy to build. They give you a bit more structure, visually contain things. But they can be a little trickier to get into for turning the compost.
So trade-off, looks for a little less convenience. What if I want to go all in, have a real dedicated composting system?
For something sturdy, long-lasting, you can build a bin using Besser blocks or railway sleepers. Great airflow, easy access. But they're a bit more expensive and take up more space.
So that's for the serious compost enthusiast, ready to commit. What about those commercial compost bins you see at garden centers?
Those are good for convenience. Come in all sorts of sizes and designs, generally easy to use, but some have limited capacity, and they can become anaerobic if you're not careful.
And I bet those tumblers I've seen advertised fall into the convenient but potentially pricey category.
Exactly. Barrels and tumblers are all about speed. They tumble the compost, which aerates it and speeds up decomposition. Great if you want compost fast, but they cost more and need more maintenance.
So there's a whole range of composting systems out there, from the simple pile to the high-tech tumbler. It's about finding what fits your needs and preferences. But no matter what, It all comes back to those four key elements, Adam, to make sure you're creating a really thriving compost ecosystem.
Absolutely. Now that we've laid the groundwork, I'm curious to dig into what you can actually do with all that lovely compost. It's more than just sprinkling it on your vegetable garden, right?
Let's get into that next.
While we were talking about all those different composting systems, something kind of struck me. With all this focus on aeration, moisture control, I wonder, how does nature do it without all our fancy bins and tumblers?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, forests break down, fallen leaves, all that organic stuff without any help from us. Is there something we can learn from how nature composts?
Oh, absolutely. Nature's system is super efficient, really resilient. It uses a whole web of organisms, bacteria, fungi, even insects, earthworms. It's a slow, steady process, perfectly adapted to the environment.
So we're trying to be all speedy and efficient with our human systems. But nature takes a more patient, interconnected approach.
Exactly. And speaking of interconnectedness, that brings us to one of nature's best composters, the earthworm. This manual spends a lot of time on worm farming, or vermicomposting, basically harnessing the power of worms to process our waste.
Yeah, worm farming always intrigued me. It seems like a great option if you don't have much space, like for apartment dwellers or people with small
It
gardens.
is. You can do it on a much smaller scale than regular composting, and it's incredibly efficient. But even though it's more contained, it still relies on those same principles we talked about: aliveness, diversity, aeration, moisture.
Right, so those Adam principles apply whether it's a big compost pile or a little worm farm. What are some things to think about when setting up and keeping a worm farm healthy?
First off, you need the right kind of worms. Regular garden worms aren't ideal for vermicomposting. You want composting worms, specifically red wigglers or togger worms. They're real eating machines, and they thrive in that confined environment.
So first step, gotta find these specialized composting worms. Are they easy to come by?
You can find them online. Some garden centers have them. Or even connect with local worm farming enthusiasts. Once you've got your worms, you need to give them a good home. This could be a store-bought worm farm. Or you can DIY it using stacked bins or old drawers.
I've seen some really cool DIY worm farm setups online. Seems like there's room to get creative and make it your own.
There is. The main thing is to keep it dark, moist, and well ventilated. Remember, they live underground naturally, so we want to recreate those conditions as best we can.
Okay, so we're building a little worm sanctuary for them to do their composting magic. What about feeding them? Can we just throw any old food scraps in there?
Not quite. Worms are pretty versatile eaters, but there are things they love and things they definitely don't. They love fruit and veggie scraps, crushed eggshells, coffee grounds, even shredded cardboard. Wow, cardboard, who knew?
Right. But things like citrus, onions, garlic, they're not so fond of. And definitely no meat or dairy products. So, gotta be mindful of what we feed our worms, just like any other pet. Sounds like there's an art to building the perfect worm buffet.
There is. And remember, they need a balanced diet too, just like us. Too much of one thing can throw off the balance in their environment. Also, chopping those scraps into smaller pieces makes it easier for them to process.
Right, so we're not just tossing scraps, we're curating their meals. So what happens once the worms have done their work? What do we do with the finished product?
Ah, that's where the real magic happens. Worm composting gives us two super valuable things: worm castings and worm tea.
Worm castings, I've heard gardeners rave about them. What's so special about them?
Well, basically it's worm poop. But don't let that turn you off. It's amazing stuff. An incredibly rich, gentle fertilizer, packed with nutrients and good microorganisms, like nature's slow-release fertilizer, giving plants a steady supply of what they need.
So they take our kitchen scraps and turn them into this concentrated plant superfood. Pretty amazing. And what about worm tea? What is that exactly?
Worm tea is the liquid that drains out of the worm farm. It's like a liquid fertilizer, packed with nutrients. You dilute it with water and use it to water your plants. Gives them a boost of nutrients and beneficial microbes.
Like an energy drink, but for plants? I'm really seeing the appeal of worm farming now. It's like having a little ecosystem working for you, turning waste into these amazing resources for your garden.
It's a really fascinating process and rewarding too. Shows how interconnected nature is and how we can be part of closing the loop, turning what we think of as waste into something valuable.
This has been a really insightful look into worm farming, but I know there are other composting methods out there. Let's explore some of those next.
Okay, so we've covered the classic compost pile and the amazing world of worm farming. What about some of the other composting methods out there? I've heard of bokashi composting, but I don't really know what it is.
Bokashi's a bit different. It uses a special mix of microorganisms, usually in a bran base, to ferment food waste. It's great for handling things you wouldn't normally compost, like meat and dairy.
So it's like pickling your food scrap.
Yeah.
Kinda, yeah.
What are the advantages of using bokashi over other methods?
Well, it's anaerobic, so it doesn't need oxygen. You can do it right in your kitchen in an airtight container. No need for a big outdoor setup. And it's pretty fast. You get fermented bokashi pre-compost in just a couple of weeks.
So it's fast, compact, and can handle those tricky food scraps. But what do you do with it once it's ready? It's not regular compost, is it?
Right, it needs a bit more processing. You can bury it in your garden, add it to a regular compost pile, or even use it to make bokashi tea, another liquid fertilizer, kind of like worm tea.
So it's like a two-stage system. You ferment the waste first, and then let it decompose further in the garden or compost pile. What about hot composting? The manual mentions it, but doesn't go into much detail.
Hot composting, sometimes called the Berkeley method, is all about speed. You build a big enough pile with the right mix and moisture to create a lot of heat. It gets hot enough to kill weed seeds and pathogens, and you get finished compost in just a few weeks.
So it's like composting on fast forward. But it sounds like you really need to pay attention to get the conditions right.
You do, you need a good amount of material, the right balance of greens and browns, and you have to keep an eye on the moisture and temperature. It's not as simple as just throwing things in a bin and forgetting about it.
It seems like there's a composting method for everyone. Whether you're all about speed, efficiency, or keeping things simple, there's a way to turn those food scraps into something valuable for your garden.
And you know what's really interesting? No matter the method, it all comes back to those same principles we've been talking about. Understanding those microorganisms, the importance of balance, aeration, moisture, that's what makes composting successful, whichever system you choose.
It's been really eye-opening exploring all these different composting techniques, and it feels like it's more than just making fertilizer. It's about connecting with nature, reducing our impact on the environment, even building a sense of community.
Couldn't agree more. Composting can really bring people together. Sharing knowledge, exchanging compost, working on community projects, it's even a great way to teach kids about sustainability and how everything's connected.
Yeah, it's amazing how something as simple as composting can have such a ripple effect, not just in our gardens, but in our communities and for the planet as a whole.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Composting is a journey, not a destination. It's about experimenting, observing, and always learning.
It's about embracing the process, the cycles of decomposition and renewal, and finding that joy in turning what we might throw away into something valuable, something that gives life.
Beautifully said.
Well, that brings us to the end of our composting adventure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of composting and worm farming. We hope you found it informative, inspiring, and maybe even a little bit life-changing. Until next time, happy composting.